Okay, so tonight we begin in the book of Romans in our survey of the New Testament. It's been said that Romans is one of the more difficult books in the New Testament to understand, simply because of the amount of information it has in relationship to righteousness and how we as individuals become the righteousness of God. So that's a pretty deep subject, and it focuses on that very heavily. The entire idea of Romans is built around that idea of righteousness.
I heard a preacher once say that when you get Romans, God gets you. It's that understanding.
Yeah.
Talk about.
And because in Romans, not only do you have the idea of Paul dealing with the law, but also justification by faith, right? And then even showing how these individuals that are being written to, how they became Christians and how they became that righteousness of God. So it's a pretty deep book, and it's one that's well worth our time to study. Again, we're only doing a survey of it, so just to get a good general idea. All right, so as always, we want to begin with the authorship of the Roman epistle. And under the authorship, the writer calls himself Paul and describes himself in such a way as only Paul could. So if you go to Romans chapter 1 and verse 1, in this epistle we have the introduction of the writer, so we know who is in fact writing. Now this is important. Romans 1:1, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called and as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. So he introduces the epistle as he being the writer of it. And 11:13, he said, but I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I've magnified my ministry. So he talks about the work that he had amongst the Gentiles. And then you can go take a look in chapter 15 as well. And when we're taking a look at why it's important to understand who the author is, again, that goes back to understanding the familiarity the writer would have with the subject matter. Paul, being a Jew and having lived under the law, certainly would have a good understanding, a great understanding of what that meant. And then understanding what it meant to find God's righteousness in some other place other than the law, because he couldn't find it under the law. And so he's going to be very familiar with that. Because the Roman epistle is written to both Jew and Gentile, and that would be the Roman church was a Jewish Gentile church. And as you go through the Roman epistle, you'll see that where at times it's a back and forth. He writes something to the Jewish audience and then something to the Gentile audience, and then he brings them together. So he's having a back and forth with it. And that plays into the idea of the theme of Romans itself. Because when you talk about the Jew and you talk about the Gentile, the reason he's bringing them together and what he's dealing with is the issue of righteousness being the same for all of them. It didn't make a difference. And the Hebrew people could not claim a special place with God and a different avenue to righteousness apart from the Gentiles. It's the same. And so if you sin, you're guilty of sin, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, and your means to being made righteous before God, it's the same way. And that would be something to consider, because you would have then answering that question, it would seem people who had a misunderstanding of that, the Hebrew people. And Paul, as you go through the Roman epistle, there are times when he explains to them their place with God and what it was about, but reminds them that they're not made righteous before God apart from the Gentiles. So it's not as if they have their own way of righteousness and the Gentiles have their way of righteousness. And that's an important point when you look at current events and the premillennial view that people hold, where God is supposed to come back into Jerusalem and establish his kingdom, and the Jews there are going to be given special treatment, right? They're going to be invited back into the kingdom. He's waiting for this great battle to take place, Armageddon, and they have this special right because they're his people. The Roman epistle just pushes that aside and says that's not the way it is at all. I mean, it's a very simple, straightforward format. Jew, you're a sinner. Gentile, you're a sinner. Jesus died for both of you, and you come to him in the same way. And you don't get special treatment because you happen to be, not of your own accord, the seed of Abraham. It was just, you might call it the luck of the draw. You just happen to be born the seed of Abraham, an Israelite, a Hebrew. And yes, God gave you his oracles, and yes, you had this certain responsibility, but the promise was to Abraham and to his seed. And when you understand the Galatian epistle, the seed is to Christ, right? And Christ died for whom? For all of us. So the epistle really deals with that idea of understanding that, and it was necessary for them to do this because it seems that part of the struggle in Romans was one group feeling a little superior to the other, the Jews feeling superior to the Gentiles. But there's also a warning because as Paul goes through and he explains to them in chapter 9, explains to them this idea of being grafted in and so forth, he reminds the Gentiles that just as God put you in, what can God do? He can take you out. So unless you get to thinking something, don't think that either. How about we all just be very humble and be grateful that God has opened up a way to him through his son to whomever would come to him. And I do find that interesting that God understood that. He knew that the Hebrew people were going to have heirs of sorts because of their past relationship, because of the fact that their God was and is in fact the God, right? Not the God of the nations, not the false gods. They are the ones who came down through Abraham and delivered their people and so forth. So this is our God. We actually have a God who is the real God. And so you can see that, that maybe they would kind of look at themselves in a wrong way, thinking that they were a special people. And beyond the fact that, special beyond the fact that God used them to bring about the Christ, he could have picked any other people to do it through. If we would have made the promise to someone else, what if we had done it that way? And they would have been left out.
There was more of a chance that the Jews would do the right thing, and that the lineage of Christ would go through them easier than the barbarians or the Gentiles.
Well, okay, so let's take it back a bit. To say that, you would have to determine the way the Jews were going to be before they ever showed up on the scene. Because the promise was made to Abraham, who's a Chaldean. So we're assuming that the Jews would have been more in line with obeying God's will hundreds of years before they ever show up. And in fact, what we find out is what? They don't. They tend to go away all the time. But there's always this remnant, there's that little remnant that's going to hang on, right? So, and I would say this, if what you're stating is true, then God knew that, right? He knew that through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? The 12 tribes, he knew how they would, he knew it. There's no question he knew it. How they would respond and how he could use them to bring about this plan. Regardless, though, it was a promise made to Abraham because of Abraham's faith, right?
It wasn't that they were going to be better from the beginning because like Adam and Eve, they weren't Jews.
Yeah.
And Abraham wasn't called a Jew.
No. Well, he was called a Hebrew.
A Hebrew.
But if you look at the definition of a Hebrew, yeah, it's not the same thing. The word for Hebrew, and I can't remember the exact definition, I looked it up one time. It's not the same thing that refers to, I don't want to say this wrong. It's where you have Jew, which is more the idea of heritage, right? Your ethnic background, right? Hebrew has a different meaning to it. I'll have to look it up, but it has something to do with one who is faithful to God, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I looked it up. But nevertheless,
The Bible was written in the Old Testament was Hebrew, right? And then the New Testament was written in Greek.
right. Yeah.
So that
Well, Aramaic, as well, but mostly Koine Greek. Yeah. And then we have the translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. So that's in Greek. So Paul would be one who would fit well into this because of his experience, his background, and his ability then with his experience to convey to them. And they're going to be receptive to it. As Paul was going out, he's converting both Jew and Gentile. Well, primarily, he's dealing with Gentiles initially, right? But along the way, there are Jews. But along the way, Gentiles are being converted. So in him writing an epistle, this will be something that would appeal to both audiences, right? The Jews would listen to it in that, one, he's inspired, but those who are not converts would listen to it because of his background, right? Who he was and his lineage. The Gentiles would listen to it because of his background, that he had become a Christian, right? And had left behind Judaism and appealed to them as well, and being that he was a Roman citizen. So, all right, so the writer calls himself Paul. Marcion, about 140 AD, said Paul wrote Romans. Irenaeus considered Romans the work of Paul. All early writers from Irenaeus on pointed to Paul as the author. Burton Kaufman said there is actually less doubt of the fact that Romans was written by the Apostle Paul than could be alleged against Thomas Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence. So that's how sure you would be that Paul wrote Romans. All the Orthodox as well as old heterodox testimonies, without a single exception, ascribe this epistle to Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ. Stronger even than this, united ancient testimony is that embedded in the epistle itself, where he claims that he's the author. The great chorus of commentators down to the present day presents a full harmony on this point. So there's really no one who disputes who the author of this is. Now, in Romans chapter 16:22, if you'll take a look over there was this individual who decided to try to throw a little wrench into the works. And in 16:22, Tertius, Tertius, who write this letter, greet you in the Lord, right? Well, he was a scribe, is what he would have been. He would have been a secretary of sorts. So, in doing this, when you see this name, he's not claiming authorship of the material. Paul claims authorship at the beginning. He is claiming that he penned it. So, Paul used him to write these things that were being written. So, and if you go back and look at Paul's difficulty with his eyesight, then certainly that would be a reason he would use a secretary, because he had problems with eyes. In all likelihood, because of what happened on the road to Damascus.
I look at it as, what you call them, a penmanship person? Scribe, right.
Scribe.
When they are used, if anything is wrong in their penmanship, then they have to do it again. So it's like he is being exact in what he's writing.
Yeah.
So that's the way I look at that, in order to verify that he wrote that.
Yeah, it just as the one who held the pen and wrote down the things that Paul was telling him. So, like a secretary would do. All right, so we have then, without question, that this epistle comes from Paul. I'm just going to give I'm going to go through this quickly here. This is some background or some history that we're going to find, and not just stuff that happened before he wrote, but his life, of who this individual is. And we're not going to look up every passage. You have those. But Paul refers to himself as a Jew, a Hebrew of Hebrews, Philippians chapter 3. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He mentions that in Philippians chapter 3. He was a Pharisee, Acts 23:6, and Philippians 3:5. We have reference to his father in Acts 23 and verse 6. He has at least one sister, Acts 23:16. He had at least one nephew, 23:16. We have no reference to his mother. That's not mentioned in his history. Paul was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, Acts 22:3. He was freeborn, Acts 22:26-28. And remember, this is the argument that he's giving when they're going to beat him. And he says, is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman citizen without trial? And he says he's freeborn. He was a young man at the time of the death of Stephen, Acts 7:58. He wasn't an older individual at that time. He was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, Acts 22:3. We've heard that name before. Where's the other place that we've heard that? Gamaliel.
Didn't he give the counsel to the Jews not to? Yeah.
In Acts chapter 5. He's the one that tells them, be careful what you do with the apostles, because they were going to beat him. Remember, they told him not to speak in this name. So this is after the resurrection of Jesus, and they're going around Jerusalem. And they had healed, in chapter 3, they healed the lame beggar, right? And they brought him before, and they told him not to speak. And then they brought him back a second time. And he said, be careful, because if this is a work of God, then we'll be found fighting against God. And if it's not, then they'll just turn into nothing, right? It'll basically handle itself. So they scourged them. And they sent them on their way, and remember what the apostles did? They went away rejoicing that they've been considered worthy to suffer for the gospel of Christ. So he was a well-known teacher of the time, a rabbi of the time, and Paul was one of his students. He was zealous for the law. And let me back up. So in Acts chapter 5, where you see him mentioned there, Paul is still, in all likelihood, one of his students. Because we don't see the conversion of Paul till chapter 9. He's at the stoning of Stephen in chapter 7. So he's still involved with this at that point in time. He was zealous for the law, Philippians chapter 3, right? He spoke of that. That was one of the reasons he did what he did, because he loved the law and was so zealous for it. He was defending it. He thought that what he was doing was the right thing, that these people were actually rising up against God's law, and he was trying to crush this rebellion.
And he had to be a very dedicated man to that.
Yes.
To be out there killing Christians.
Yeah.
And doing the things
That zeal that he had, yes, sir. And that plays into what he becomes, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because
once you turn somebody like that, and you turn a real he's going to be dedicated to that now.
Yes.
With the same zealousness.
And he was. Especially once he realizes the truth. But this is the thing about Saul. His conversion is not going to be easy. In fact, in order to bring him to the Lord, fill in the blank.
One thing, had a certain person.
The Lord had to show up, yeah. In order to bring him to the Lord had to show up. Saul, why hast thou persecuting me? Oh, okay, this is not a good situation here. Who art thou, Lord? So, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, right? So, but I think that's a good point, son, because he was so dedicated to it. He owned all of that. That was his life. He committed himself to it. And when you look in Philippians, remember what he says about all those things, chapter 3, all those things that he counted as gain, he did what with them? He said, I count them as loss. He gave all that up. For what? To know Christ and his resurrection. So as powerful and devoted as he was to the law, he was more so to the new covenant and his Christian faith when he became a Christian through.
You find that in the world today. If you go out there and teach someone who is, I'm talking a real sinner that's mean,
Right.
And you convert him, there's more to be forgiven. So therefore, they're more, yeah.
It's interesting too, because you're right. Oftentimes you see that with someone lost, right? I mean, okay, let me kind of clarify that. Unchurched, unreligious. The interesting thing is that with religious people, sometimes it goes the complete opposite. I have heard that there is a particular sect out there that if you can convince them that their other testament is not really the Word of God, and that their faith is not really in God, and you can show them the truth, they won't convert. And I'm not saying 100%, right? There's always going to be, but it's because they're so stooped in what they believe. If you convince them otherwise, then they can't believe anything. We believe this so deeply, commit ourselves so deeply to this. If you've shown us not real, we don't want anything. Now, I've seen that before with people, with an individual I was studying with who believed he was working miracles, and I showed him why that wasn't the case. And he said, if I don't have that, I don't have anything. I was like, so if he wasn't able to speak in tongues or do whatever he said he was doing, and I showed him in the text with biblically that's not in line with New Testament scriptures, that Christians today don't practice those things, he just didn't want to hear it. I have to have that or I don't have anything. So he didn't, you know.
The ones that are, if they're so committed to it that they will not believe anything else. Actually, in world standards, by the world standards, they're very good people.
Oh yeah.
They're very good people. They're just not watching.
Well, maybe what they do is they just say, well, I'll just, I'll hope for the best. I'm not going to follow anything but I hope for the best. But on the other hand, people that, and this is what happens with the Gentiles, as Paul is going out and trying to take the message to the Hebrew people, and a large portion keep rejecting him, the Gentiles don't reject him. They hear it and they want that, right? They want to know what he's talking about. And so eventually he says, okay, well, I'm going to turn to the Gentiles because you've rejected what I'm teaching you. All right, so he was zealous for the law. He persecuted the church, Acts 8, 9, and Philippians 3. His conversion is recorded 3 times in the book of Acts, 9, 22, and 26. He saw Jesus, Acts 9, 4, and 5. And that's after Jesus' resurrection. He was baptized into Christ by Ananias, Acts 22, 12 through 16. He preached the faith which once he destroyed, Galatians 1:23. So what he was trying to destroy, he now went around teaching that. He was a tent maker, Acts 18:3. He was not married, 1 Corinthians 9:5. He wrote at least 13 books of the New Testament, about 25%. He was a chosen vessel, Acts 9:15. And in fact, remember what Ananias tells him in Acts chapter 9, that he's a chosen vessel of God, and to tell him what he must suffer, right, for this cause. So he certainly was going to face a lot of suffering for the sake of Christ. He went on 3 missionary journeys. He was an apostle, Romans 1:1, and his apostleship did not come from man, but came from Jesus himself. So that's important. Why?
Because it shows that he was a true apostle.
True apostle, thus authoritative.
That was a recommendation to know the resurrection of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when he writes these epistles, he wants them to know, I'm an apostle. I was chosen by Jesus. I'm a chosen vessel. So the things I'm going to write to you, you need to be listening to. Which is funny because when you have in feminism today, women don't like to hear some of the things he has to say in 1 Corinthians, and then all of a sudden they just discount that he's a chosen vessel and an apostle, and they don't want to listen to that anymore because that's not the way it is today. He was a chauvinist, and so they forget about him being a chosen vessel of God, and one who was authoritative in his writing because he was inspired of God. He was once blind, Acts 9:8. We see that when the scales are over his eye. He rebuked Peter to his face, Galatians chapter 2, 11 through 14. Remember that? In Antioch, what was Peter doing?
Going to the Jews and ignoring the Gentiles.
Yeah. So when the Jews would come down from Jerusalem, Peter would separate himself from the Gentiles, and he would eat with them. And it was such a powerful act on Peter's part. Who else got caught up in it? Barnabas got caught up in it. The son of encouragement, he gets caught up in this. And when Paul comes down, publicly he rebukes Peter to his face and tells him, why are you doing this? Why are you putting this on them? So,
James,
yes, sir.
I always had a question about this. All right, when he saw Jesus, he was blind.
Yeah.
Jesus healed him. Now, and everybody, he had a thorn in the flesh.
Right.
And everybody says it was his eyesight.
Right.
But he doesn't really say ever
No.
that that's what it was.
No.
If Jesus healed it, why
Well,
wasn't it,
so-
why was it still there?
Okay. Because he says why it's there. He said his grace is sufficient for him, right? He prayed 3 times. When Paul is healed, it's because Ananias lays his hands on him, right? So Ananias comes, he lays his hands, and the scales fall from his eye. Jesus could heal you completely, right? We know that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that he would always do it. And in Paul's case, it doesn't seem like he did. It was a way to keep him from exalting himself, right? So it was a means to keep him in check and trust in the grace of God and all that he did. So God left something there for him, right? And maybe, and again, it doesn't say the thorn in the flesh, right, that he's praying about. It doesn't say that it was his eyesight. It doesn't mention what it is. But when you go back and you look at, he's asking to be healed, and God doesn't take that away from him, right? Well, and think about this. God didn't heal everybody in the New Testament. What about Timothy? Timothy has stomach problems. And what did Paul tell him to do? Drink a little wine for it. It's like, well, hey, Paul, why don't you come over and lay... Could Paul have laid his hands on him? Yeah. I mean, Paul passed on to Timothy miraculous gift. Well, how come he didn't heal him? Because just because you could do something and God could do something doesn't mean he was going to do it. Sometimes there's a reason to leave things in place.
Somebody told me one time that sometimes God leaves you with a little something so you don't think you're too perfect. Yeah.
That is. Yeah. Yeah, so it was a reminder of, and not necessarily a punishment, but, Paul had to deal with the fact that he was part of Christians being put to death, put to prison, right, there when Stephen. So that was something that, God bestowed his grace upon him and forgave him and so forth and put him into work. But remember what Paul says about himself in 1 Timothy chapter 1. He saw himself as the chief of all sinners. So he elevated himself, and I know we can say, well, anybody can say that. Now, Paul actually believed it, right? Paul really saw himself as Romans in chapter 7, wretched man that I am, right? Paul saw himself as one who was not deserving of this at all. So maybe this being left there was a means for him to remain humble and just simply serve God, and a reminder of his past, maybe.
The purpose of the miracles was to really make it known that you were speaking from God.
Right.
Essentially that type of thing. And for him to heal Timothy wouldn't really fit that criteria.
Yeah. But the lame beggar was healed.
Yeah.
So there were people that were healed with the miracles, and it was proof of what they were speaking. So yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying. It's like, well, what would have been the purpose? Because Timothy is a convert, and
Exactly. They didn't heal a lot of people.
but in fact, when you go back and you look in 1 Corinthians, not everybody in the first century had gifts anyway, right? It wasn't like everybody that was a Christian ran around performing miracles. That wasn't the case at all.
And you don't see the gift of healing used very much except by the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it was widely. The Holy Spirit gave them out. So
Right.
Mostly
1 Corinthians chapter 12, yeah, the Holy Spirit distributed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you think about it, prophecy was good to let people know what was going on, and tongue speaking was good because you could communicate and share the gospel. So
Yeah.
those two, I think, were the prevalent ones.
Yeah. He taught kings and governors. So Paul had an audience with the highest people in the courts, right? He was able to go to them and take the message to them. He had a thorn in his flesh, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Go ahead and take a look over there in verse 7 and see how he says this in regards to, and again, it doesn't say exactly, it's just conjecture on our part, but when you look at the difficulty with his eyesight and so forth, that just seems to be a credible possibility there. 12 and verse 7. Right, so Well, let's just start in verse 1. He says, boasting is necessary, though it's not profitable, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows such a man, was caught up to the third heaven. So that's around 41 to 43 AD he's making reference to there. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. On behalf of such a man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in regard to my weakness. For I do not wish to boast, for if I do not wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from this, so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, for this reason, to keep me from doing what? Yeah, that's what we said earlier, to keep him from exalting himself. To keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave. And he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distress, with persecution, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So, and maybe that goes back to the character of Paul, you know.
Sometimes that exalting yourself, sometimes you can see that in very successful preachers.
Oh, yeah.
And pretty soon it becomes the message is about them.
It's not the message anymore, yeah.
They say that Christ is always strong, but then him being a human, he had to die. So that was a weakness that he had.
Yeah, when he took on human flesh, yeah.
So that made him strong in death.
Yeah, I can see that. So, if you think about what he said, so I kept from exalting myself, here's a question. And think about this. What you know about Paul, does he seem like the kind of guy who would exalt himself? Seems like a very humble individual.
The old Paul.
Okay, tell me something about the old Paul that makes you think he might have exalted himself.
He was killing the Christians, boasting.
Okay, keep going.
And he kept against Christ where he was taught that all that was going to come.
Okay, wait, let's back up. He was killing Christians. Think about that.
And he was exalted by the rabbis and the exalted Jews who were around him.
Well, let me ask you something. Who told him to go do that?
The rabbis.
No, he chose, that was his decision. He got letters from them, but Paul took this upon himself, right? I'm going to stop this.
I'm going to take care of this new movement over here myself. I'm going to put a stop to it.
It's similar to what you see in Peter. Remember Peter, he was boasting, I'll never deny you, right? Everyone else denies you. So Peter had this tendency to exalt himself as well, and then he denies the Lord, and so 3 times. And so Paul, I believe, showed that in the fact that, now you may say, no, but wait a minute, that was a great, he did out of the zeal for the Lord. Yeah, but no one ran up to Paul and said, hey, come here, buddy, we need to go get these guys. It seems Paul ran up and said, I volunteer to go do this. Well, why do you think you should be doing this? Well, because I'm Paul, I'm Saul. It's like, okay. I just think it's curious that, why was he the one out there doing it? Why was he getting these letters? His background. And if you go back and look at what he says in Philippians chapter 3, how he talks about himself. He does it in Philippians, he's not doing it in an arrogant way. But he said, if they want to boast, what?
I can boast.
I much more, right? I can boast.
He was a Pharisee.
Pharisee of Pharisees, the tribe of Benjamin, right? A Hebrew of Hebrews. So I could see that there may have been a time when Paul would have been like, yeah, I don't know who you are, but I'm Saul, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, found what?
Blameless.
He said blameless. Blameless. So, I mean, I had it all going on.
Also, he had a pretty well-off background. He was
Yeah.
evidently, from money people, so that also could lend into arrogance.
Well, and you think about the fact that he's not only a Jew, but he's a Roman citizen. I mean, this guy's, right? He's got some protection here. So he's not a Roman citizen that bought it. He was born a free man. So he's like, I'm well connected here.
He was also very brilliant, and he'd been taught by the best teachers.
Yes, he was. As a matter of fact, I believe one of the writers that I read said that he would have been considered one of the best, or the brightest, most educated individual of his time. That's the way they viewed him. So,
Something more to boast about.
yeah. Well, and when you look at him and you see, it's like the idea of the thorn in the flesh attitude, or his conversion, right? He was so zealous, but then how dedicated is he to the Lord? In the same way, as much as he may have been boastful as a Jew, he was very humble as a servant of God, right? So it kind of follows the path where he would just go that other way with it and abandon. And that's not an easy trek. It's not an easy thing to go from being someone who was well known, right, well connected, everything's set up for him as far as that goes, and then to give all that up and to pursue after a life that ends up doing what? You're persecuted. They're trying to kill you. Yeah.
We used to describe that as getting your bubble busted.
Yeah.
Like there was people in our business that just thought they were the greatest thing in the world, and then something happened, and they were lucky to even have a job.
Yeah, right.
They had their bubble busted.
Yeah. And things are still going on. All right, let me finish up here real quick. He was one of the most educated men of the first century. And this is coming from Wesley Simmons in the World Reader Bible School material. He had put this list together. All right, we'll stop there. Next week, we're going to take a look at the place and the date of Romans, and where it was written, and then in what time frame this epistle was written.